For 3 years, they treated her like a stupid, silent piece of furniture. But they forgot one crucial detail. She was silently memorizing every single one of their dark secrets. For 3 years, they treated her like a stupid, silent piece of furniture. But they forgot one crucial detail. She was silently memorizing every single one of their dark secrets. The Red Dress of Ruin. Chapter 1. The Velvet Curtain of Disdain. In the glittering, exclusive world of high society, an untarnished reputation is the most expensive currency of all. And Lady Elinor Sterling was the undisputed, ruthless keeper of that priceless vault. She had built her empire not with bricks and mortar, but with unspoken rules, icy etiquette, and judging glares. Anyone who wished to step into this elite circle of power had to bow before her absolute authority. For Elinor, the untouchable prestige of the Sterling family was more important than anything else in the world. However, the flawless masterpiece she had spent decades carefully painting was suddenly ruined by a girl named Clara. Clara was the young wife of Julian, the only son and sole heir to the massive Sterling real estate conglomerate. Unlike the refined, aristocratic heiresses Elinor had handpicked for him, Clara was merely an orphaned girl from a working-class background. Julian's stubborn decision to bring Clara through the gilded doors of the manor felt like a direct, unforgivable slap to Elinor's immense pride. For 3 long years of marriage, Clara had been trapped in a suffocating living nightmare paved with roses and diamonds. Elinor never once resorted to vulgar screaming or physical violence against her unwanted daughter-in-law. Instead, she weaponized social humiliation, turning it into the sharpest and most venomous blade imaginable. She transformed elegant afternoon tea parties into unofficial, terrifying courtrooms where Clara was always the guilty defendant on trial. Every awkward gesture, every slightly improper sentence Clara uttered was magnified and paraded around as a cruel joke for the elite to laugh at. Next month marked the highly anticipated 50th anniversary of the Sterling Corporation. This was not just a simple business event, but a grand gala gathering the most powerful and influential figures in the entire country. Elinor had personally overseen every single detail, from the gold-leafed invitations to the imported Michelin-starred menu. But hidden deep beneath all this bustling, glamorous preparation was a sinister, calculated plan she had been secretly harboring for months. Elinor had firmly decided that this anniversary gala would be Clara's absolute final performance in high society. She wanted to orchestrate a public shaming of such brutal magnitude, a Category 5 social humiliation, that no one in their circle would ever forget it. Elinor's ultimate goal was devastatingly clear. She wanted to force Clara to sign divorce papers in utter disgrace and disappear from Julian's life forever. To properly set the stage, Elinor began by methodically isolating Clara within the very walls of her own home. She pretended to be unexpectedly friendly, assigning Clara the grand task of preparing the opening speech to honor the senior board members. It seemed like an incredible honor and a chance to finally shine, but in reality, it was a carefully laid, inescapable trap. Elinor knew perfectly well that Clara suffered from crippling social anxiety and a severe stutter when speaking in front of powerful people. But the cruel matriarch did not stop there, taking her scheme a step further into absolute malice. She secretly changed the entire dress code for the board of directors without uttering a single word of warning to Clara. While all the other elite wives received private memos instructing them to wear elegant, understated black evening gowns, Clara received a special gift box from her mother-in-law. Inside lay a dazzling, brightly colored red dress, complete with a daring slit and a deceptive note claiming it was the color of ultimate power. Clara, desperate for any shred of acceptance, naively believed that her mother-in-law had finally opened her heart and wanted her to stand out beside Julian. She carefully cherished the red dress, staying up for countless nights to practice her speech in the mirror until her throat was raw. Julian, completely consumed by his billion-dollar construction projects, remained entirely oblivious to the devastating storm about to swallow his wife whole. He simply smiled, patted Clara gently on the head, and praised her hard work before rushing off to his waiting chauffeured car. He completely missed the freezing, predatory glare his mother shot down from the shadows of the second-floor balcony. Elinor smirked coldly as she watched her foolish, trusting daughter-in-law treat the gaudy dress like a precious treasure. She had every single detail perfectly aligned to ensure that when the spotlight hit, Clara would look like a cheap, misplaced pawn on a chessboard of kings and queens. The ultimate humiliation does not come from being shouted at in private, but from being stared down by hundreds of respected people with absolute pity and utter disgust. And Elinor was fully prepared to deliver that fatal, silent blow. She was ready to teach this poor, pathetic girl a permanent, agonizing lesson about her true place in the world. The massive antique clock in the grand hall ticked away, counting down the stressful days to the historic, ruinous gala. The wind began to howl through the stained glass windows of the manor, signaling the rapid approach of a catastrophic storm. The red velvet curtain was slowly rising, and the most ruthless, devastating stage play of Clara's life had officially begun. Chapter 2: The Red Dress of Ruin. The night of the Sterling Corporation's 50th anniversary gala finally arrived, draping the city in an air of heavy, suffocating anticipation. A fleet of sleek black limousines lined up outside the grand Sterling Manor, dropping off the most powerful and influential figures in the country. Inside, the grand ballroom was a breathtaking, intimidating sea of black velvet, flawless diamonds, and calculated whispers. Every single guest had strictly followed the unspoken but rigorously enforced dress code, wearing elegant shades of midnight black and charcoal. They moved gracefully under the brilliant light of the massive crystal chandeliers, forming a united, impenetrable front of old money and untouchable prestige. Then, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand entrance slowly creaked open, drawing the attention of the elite crowd. Clara stepped into the ballroom, her heart pounding frantically against her ribcage like a trapped bird. She was completely, blissfully unaware of the absolute disaster she was about to walk into with a bright, hopeful smile on her face. Adorned in the dazzling, bright red gown gifted by her mother-in-law, Clara stood out like a bleeding wound in a room full of dark shadows. The vibrant silk clung perfectly to her figure, sparkling with hundreds of hand-sewn rubies that caught the blinding light. For a brief, fleeting second, Clara actually felt beautiful, foolishly believing she finally belonged in this world of unimaginable wealth. But that naive illusion completely shattered the moment she took her first hesitant step down the sweeping marble staircase. The gentle, rhythmic hum of polite conversation suddenly stopped, replaced by a deafening, terrifying silence that sucked the air out of the room. Hundreds of judgmental eyes turned simultaneously toward the staircase, locking onto the young woman in the glaringly inappropriate red dress. The crushing silence only lasted for a mere heartbeat before the cruel, cutting whispers began to slither through the glittering crowd like venomous snakes. Wealthy women hid their mocking, vicious smiles behind crystal champagne flutes, exchanging cold glances that felt sharper than any physical blade. Powerful men in meticulously tailored tuxedos raised their eyebrows in sheer disbelief, shaking their heads at what they perceived as a pathetic, desperate cry for attention. Clara's breath violently hitched in her throat as she desperately scanned the massive room. She realized with absolute, paralyzing horror that she was the only person in the entire venue who was not wearing black. The sheer weight of their collective disgust crashed down on her fragile shoulders, making her tremble uncontrollably under the spotlight. From the far end of the room, standing confidently on a raised VIP platform, Elinor Sterling watched the tragic scene unfold with immense, malicious satisfaction. The calculating matriarch casually held a glass of vintage wine, her face, a perfect, unreadable mask of polite maternal concern that expertly hid the poison in her heart. Elinor knew exactly how to manipulate the crowd, subtly leaning into the ear of a prominent senator's wife to whisper a fake, condescending apology for her daughter-in-law's shocking lack of class. Julian, who had arrived hours earlier to greet the prestigious board of directors, pushed his way through the dense crowd with a look of utter confusion on his handsome face. He finally reached the bottom of the grand staircase just as Clara, completely paralyzed by the intense public humiliation, felt her vision start to dangerously blur. "What on earth are you wearing, Clara?" Julian whispered harshly, his voice laced with a heavy mixture of shock and embarrassment rather than the protective support she desperately needed. Those simple, thoughtless, cutting words from her own husband were the final, devastating blow that shattered Clara's already crumbling composure. She desperately wanted to scream that his mother had personally sent the dress, that this was all a terrible, cruel setup designed to destroy her. But the overwhelming, suffocating panic tightened like a physical noose around her throat, choking the desperate words before they could even form on her lips. Her severe social anxiety, the exact fatal weakness Alina was banking on, surged forward like an unstoppable, destructive tidal wave. Clara could feel the burning heat rushing to her pale cheeks, the frantic, deafening beating of her heart echoing loudly in her own ears. Every sudden camera flash from the hired press felt like a physical strike to her face, permanently capturing her ultimate, unforgivable disgrace for the world to see. Alina then raised a single hand, signaling the grand orchestra to abruptly stop playing. This silent command effectively forced the entire ballroom to focus their absolute, undivided attention on the trembling girl frozen on the stairs. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological torture, executed flawlessly by a woman who viewed human dignity as nothing more than a disposable chess piece. The microphone on the main stage suddenly crackled to life, echoing loudly and ominously through the massive, glittering hall. And now, ladies and gentlemen, a special opening speech from my dear, ambitious daughter-in-law, Alina's voice rang out, dripping with a sickeningly fake sweetness that made Clara's blood run cold. Clara gripped the cold golden banister, her knuckles turning bone-white as she tried desperately to anchor herself to a reality that was rapidly spinning out of control. The glamorous faces in the crowd began to warp and blur into a terrifying mosaic of judging eyes and sneering, merciless lips. This wasn't just a simple, unfortunate mistake in fashion. It was a deliberate, meticulously calculated excommunication from high society. Alina was sending a crystal-clear, brutal message to every single billionaire in the room. This girl is an outsider, a pathetic joke, and she will never, ever be one of us. Even the professional waitstaff, carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres, seemed to pause and stare openly at the spectacular failure unfolding before their eyes. Julian nervously adjusted his silk tie, visibly taking a physical step back to distance himself from the toxic epicenter of the embarrassment. That small, involuntary step backward broke Clara's heart far more than any of the vicious whispers from the strangers ever could. She realized in that devastating, soul-crushing moment that she was completely, hopelessly alone in a glamorous den of exquisitely dressed wolves. The towering microphone on the mahogany podium seemed to mock her from afar, waiting for the stuttering, pathetic speech Alina had ruthlessly forced her to prepare. Clara closed her eyes tight, the bright red of the dress burning vividly against the darkness of her eyelids, as she took a shaky, uncertain step forward into the merciless, blinding spotlight. The heavy silence in the room grew even thicker, practically suffocating her with the sheer anticipation and the collective amusement of the city's elite. Every agonizing second that ticked by felt like an absolute eternity of torment, specifically designed to break her spirit into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She knew with absolute certainty that if she stepped up to that microphone, the stuttering would start, and her public execution would be absolutely complete. Yet, the suffocating, intense pressure of hundreds of billionaires staring her down left her with absolutely no avenue of escape. This was a true Category 5 social humiliation, an inescapable, devastating hurricane of shame orchestrated by the very woman who was supposed to be her family. Chapter 3: The Long Walk to the Podium. The distance from the bottom of the grand staircase to the imposing mahogany podium was exactly 42 steps. To Clara, it felt like an agonizing, never-ending march across a desolate desert of judging eyes and whispered insults. Her legs felt as heavy as solid lead, trembling so violently she feared her knees would buckle at any given moment. The expensive ruby-encrusted heels, which had made her feel like a literal princess just an hour ago, now felt like heavy iron shackles dragging her toward a public execution. Every single time the delicate, vibrant silk of her red gown rustled against the polished marble floor, the sound seemed to amplify in the suffocating, unnatural silence of the ballroom. The glamorous crowd parted slowly before her, deliberately stepping back to clear a path as if her humiliation were a highly contagious disease. She could vividly see the mocking smirks of the wealthy heiresses she had tried so desperately hard to befriend over the years, their cold eyes glittering with unadulterated cruelty. She frantically searched the vast, glittering sea of faces for a single shred of empathy, a reassuring nod, or even a fake smile of pity. There was absolutely nothing to be found but cold, aristocratic amusement perfectly masked as polite, quiet observation. When she finally reached the towering stage, the 3 shallow wooden steps leading up to the microphone looked like an impossible, insurmountable mountain to climb. Clara grasped the cold, polished handrail, her pale skin slick with a freezing, terrified sweat that ruined her expensive perfume. She dragged her trembling body upward, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps that she prayed the sensitive microphone would not pick up. Standing completely alone behind the heavy mahogany podium, she looked out over the sprawling, intimidating ocean of black velvet and impeccably tailored tuxedos. The blinding, harsh glare of the theatrical spotlights hit her directly in the face, making her feel completely exposed, naked, and utterly defenseless before her executioners. Right in the front row, Elinor Sterling sat elegantly in a plush velvet chair, casually crossing her legs while wearing an unreadable expression of triumphant anticipation. The ruthless matriarch slowly offered Clara a firm, encouraging nod that was so heavily dripping with venom, it made the young woman physically nauseous. Julian was nowhere to be seen in the immediate crowd, having cowardly retreated to the shadowy back of the room by the towering champagne fountain. His deliberate, cowardly absence was the final rusted nail aggressively hammered into the coffin of Clara's already shattered confidence. She reached into her small designer clutch purse with violently shaking fingers and pulled out the crisp white index cards containing her meticulously memorized speech. The very moment the heavy paper touched her sweaty hands, her severe, uncontrollable tremor caused the cards to flutter rapidly like dying moths in a jar. She leaned nervously into the microphone, a horrific, screeching feedback of static echoing through the grand hall and causing several billionaires to flinch in dramatic, exaggerated disgust. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Clara began softly, her fragile voice cracking painfully on the very first syllable of the sentence. The severe stutter, her most shameful and heavily guarded personal secret, erupted with a devastating vengeance fueled by pure, unadulterated panic. A collective, barely muffled gasp rippled through the sophisticated audience, followed instantly by a cruel, devastating wave of stifled, mocking giggles. Clara gripped the sharp wooden edges of the podium so tightly that her perfectly manicured fingernails threatened to snap completely in half. I am honored to stand before you today, she stammered uncontrollably, the simple words tearing at her dry throat like jagged shards of broken glass. Hot tears of absolute, paralyzing mortification violently pricked the corners of her eyes, threatening to ruin her flawless makeup and complete the tragic, pathetic spectacle. She looked desperately down at her prepared notes, but the carefully typed black letters had suddenly blurred into a meaningless, swirling vortex of dark ink. The oppressive silence in the massive room had abruptly shifted from shocked observation to active, malicious, and highly entertaining mockery. A prominent, silver-haired board member in the second row leaned intimately over to his diamond-clad wife and whispered something that caused them both to erupt in silent, shaking laughter. Elinor simply tilted her chin upward, her perfectly arched eyebrows raised in a theatrical, Oscar-worthy display of feigned pity for the struggling, pathetic girl. Clara tried frantically to swallow the massive, suffocating lump of pure terror in her throat, taking a deep, shuddering breath to try and forcefully reset her vocal cords. 50 years of S. Sterling legacy is a TT triumph, she finally forced out, a single, rogue tear breaking free and tracing a hot, burning path down her pale cheek. The highly sensitive microphone picked up the wet, pathetic, echoing sniffle that followed, permanently broadcasting her complete emotional breakdown to the entire elite assembly. Someone standing in the back of the massive room intentionally coughed, a loud, artificial, grating sound that was clearly meant to aggressively mock her agonizing, painful pauses. The vibrant red dress, which was deceptively pitched to her as a bold symbol of power, now felt like a giant, glowing target painted directly onto her bleeding heart. She was hopelessly trapped inside a suffocating glass box, a strange and pitiful specimen being mercilessly poked and prodded by the ruthless aristocracy for their evening entertainment. Every single stuttered syllable she pushed out was a brutal, physical strike against her remaining dignity, permanently erasing her identity and replacing it with a cruel punchline. She finally realized in that blinding moment that Alina didn't just want to embarrass her. The evil matriarch wanted to mentally and psychologically break her in front of the entire world. The chilled air in the lavish ballroom grew suffocatingly thin, and Clara's chest tightened agonizingly as the first terrifying wave of a massive panic attack crashed over her fragile body. Her vision tunneled violently, the glittering, diamond-like chandeliers above her beginning to spin wildly in a dizzying, sickening circle of blinding white light. She opened her mouth desperately to try and speak the next rehearsed line, but absolutely no sound came out of her frozen throat. She stood frozen there in complete, horrific silence for 10 agonizing seconds, her mouth silently opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the safety of the water. The brutal, cutting whispers from the crowd rapidly escalated into an audible, chaotic, and terrifying buzz of ultimate judgment that completely filled the enormous, glittering room. It was the absolute zenith of social humiliation, a flawless, terrifying, and total victory meticulously orchestrated by the untouchable Lady Alina Sterling. Clara slowly let go of the podium, her perfectly rehearsed index cards slipping from her trembling fingers and scattering aimlessly across the dark mahogany stage like fallen white petals. Chapter 4: The Shattered Illusion. The scattered index cards drifted down to the polished wooden stage like white feathers from a fatally wounded bird. A collective gasp, much louder and far less disguised than the previous ones, echoed sharply through the cavernous ballroom. Clara stood completely paralyzed behind the heavy mahogany podium, her empty hands trembling violently in the freezing, air-conditioned space. The suffocating silence that followed the falling cards was heavier than lead, pressing down on her chest until she could barely draw a breath. Every single pair of aristocratic eyes in the massive hall remained ruthlessly fixed on her, eagerly consuming her spectacular mental collapse. From her front row velvet seat, Alina Sterling finally decided that her masterpiece of destruction had reached its perfect, agonizing climax. The calculating matriarch rose gracefully to her feet, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles of her impeccable black designer gown. She walked slowly and deliberately up the short wooden steps of the stage, her high heels clicking rhythmically like a metronome of doom. Alina placed a cold, perfectly manicured hand on Clara's violently shaking shoulder, her diamond rings biting sharply into the bare skin. "Oh, my poor, fragile dear," Alina cooed directly into the live microphone, her voice dripping with a sickeningly artificial honey that fooled the entire room. She gently but firmly pushed Clara away from the podium, physically removing the terrified girl from her rightful place in the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must deeply apologize for my daughter-in-law's sudden and unfortunate indisposition," Alina announced with flawless, practiced elegance. "She has always possessed a rather delicate constitution, and the sheer magnitude of our glorious legacy has simply overwhelmed her." The crowd murmured in sympathetic agreement with the matriarch, instantly shifting their collective narrative to praise Alina's endless patience and grace. Clara was completely stripped of her voice, her agency, and her dignity in a matter of a few meticulously calculated seconds. She was no longer the wife of the billionaire heir. She was merely a pathetic, broken charity case that the Sterling family graciously tolerated. Alina turned her head slightly away from the audience and leaned into Clara's ear, dropping the benevolent facade for a fraction of a second. "Get out of my sight, you pathetic little beggar," the older woman hissed with a venomous hatred that chilled Clara right down to the bone. The sheer brutality of those whispered words acted as a violent shock to Clara's system, abruptly snapping her out of her paralyzing panic attack. She stumbled backward, her heavy, ruby-encrusted heels scraping loudly and awkwardly against the polished wooden floorboards of the stage. Desperation clawed at her throat as she desperately scanned the shadowy back of the ballroom for a single, final glimpse of her husband. She finally spotted Julian standing near the towering champagne fountain, surrounded by a group of wealthy, laughing investors. In that defining, heartbreaking moment, Julian slowly raised his glass to his lips and deliberately turned his back to the stage, refusing to even look at her. That simple, cowardly gesture severed the final, fraying thread of hope that had kept Clara tethered to this toxic, superficial world. She realized that the man she had loved unconditionally was nothing more than a spineless extension of his mother's ruthless ambition. A sudden, overwhelming surge of pure adrenaline flooded her veins, replacing the crippling fear with a desperate, blinding need to escape. Clara turned sharply and practically ran down the side stairs of the stage, her vibrant red dress flowing behind her like a trail of fresh blood. The sophisticated crowd parted instantly as she rushed through the aisle, pulling their expensive gowns away as if her failure were a contagious disease. She kept her eyes firmly fixed on the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the hall, refusing to shed another tear in front of her tormentors. Every hurried step she took felt like a conscious, permanent rebellion against the invisible chains that had bound her for 3 miserable years. She violently pushed through the massive double doors, bursting out of the suffocating ballroom and into the empty, dimly lit main corridor of the manor. The sudden, absolute silence of the grand hallway wrapped around her like a protective blanket, momentarily shielding her from the cruel whispers. But the heavy, oppressive walls of the Sterling estate still felt like a gilded cage threatening to lock her away forever. Without a second thought, she reached down and unbuckled the straps of her agonizingly expensive heels, kicking them aggressively across the marble floor. She grabbed the heavy, sparkling fabric of her red gown, hiking it up above her knees as she sprinted barefoot toward the grand front entrance. The startled security guards standing by the main doors barely had time to react before she pushed past them and burst out into the night. The violent storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke, sending sheets of freezing, torrential rain crashing down onto the sprawling driveway. Clara welcomed the icy downpour, letting the furious rain wash away the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and aristocratic arrogance. She ran wildly down the long, winding gravel path of the estate, the sharp stones cutting into her bare feet, but she didn't feel a single ounce of pain. For the very first time in 3 long, agonizing years, she finally felt the intoxicating, terrifying, and beautiful rush of absolute freedom. Chapter 5. The Baptism of the Storm. The freezing rain felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing her bare skin, but to Clara, it was the ultimate necessary baptism. She ran blindly through the massive, ornate iron gates of the Sterling estate, leaving the suffocating world of billionaires and calculated cruelty far behind her. The heavy, ruby-encrusted silk of the red dress was now completely soaked, dragging behind her on the wet pavement like a heavy, blood-soaked anchor. Every frantic step on the rough, unforgiving asphalt tore at the tender soles of her bare feet, sending sharp jolts of agony up her legs. Yet, the intense physical pain was a surprisingly welcome distraction from the agonizing, hollow ache that had completely consumed her shattered heart. She didn't stop running until her lungs burned like roaring fire, and her trembling, exhausted legs finally gave out beneath her on an empty, dimly lit street corner. Clara collapsed heavily onto a rusted metal bus stop bench, the freezing, violent wind whipping her soaked, tangled hair across her pale, tear-stained face. She stared blankly down the long, desolate road she had just traveled, half expecting to see Julian's expensive black limousine speeding through the storm to rescue her. She waited for the familiar glow of headlights, hoping against all rational logic that her husband would suddenly appear and beg for her forgiveness. But the dark, rain-swept street remained completely, devastatingly empty, cementing the harsh, undeniable reality of her husband's absolute, cowardly betrayal. He had deliberately chosen the comfortable, glittering cage of his mother's financial empire over the vulnerable woman he had solemnly sworn to protect in front of God. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped her trembling, blue lips as she finally understood how pathetically naive and dangerously foolish she had been for the past 3 years. She had willingly stripped away every single authentic piece of her identity, violently molding herself into a quiet, submissive porcelain doll just to appease a family that despised her very existence. The blinding headlights of a passing night shift delivery truck briefly illuminated the battered bus stop, reflecting Clara's ruined image in the shattered glass pane of the shelter. She looked at the pathetic, drowning woman staring back at her, barely recognizing the hollow, terrified eyes that were now framed by thick, running streams of black mascara. The breathtaking red dress, brilliantly designed by a leaner to be the ultimate weapon of public destruction, now clung to her shivering frame like a tragic, ridiculous Halloween costume. It was a glaring, brightly colored symbol of her complete isolation, a cruel joke that she had unknowingly paraded in front of the most powerful people in the country. Slowly, with a sudden sense of deliberate, burning purpose cutting through her despair, Clara reached up to her freezing, trembling neck. Her numb fingers clumsily fumbled with the intricate clasp of the heavy, diamond-studded choker that a leaner had forced upon her as a manipulative welcome gift. The expensive, complicated lock finally clicked open, and Clara let the suffocating, multi-million-dollar collar drop unceremoniously into a muddy puddle at her severely bruised feet. She didn't even flinch as the priceless jewels sank beneath the murky water, feeling only an immense, breathless wave of relief wash over her chest. She then looked down at her left hand, where the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring weighed down her slender ring finger like a permanent, glittering shackle. Without a single ounce of hesitation or regret, she pulled the cold platinum band over her knuckle and tossed it carelessly into the dark, swirling water of a nearby storm drain. The quiet, metallic splash echoed loudly in her ears, sounding exactly like the heavy iron lock of a maximum security prison cell finally clicking open. She was entirely broke, completely stranded in the middle of a violent thunderstorm with absolutely nowhere to go, yet she felt infinitely richer than anyone inside that miserable, fake ballroom. Eleanor Sterling had meticulously planned this category 5 social humiliation to completely break her spirit, crush her self-worth, and force her into quiet, desperate submission. The ruthless, calculating matriarch fully expected Clara to crawl away into the dark shadows, broken and humiliated, ready to immediately sign whatever predatory legal documents were shoved in front of her. But the brutal, calculated public execution of the evening had unexpectedly triggered an entirely different, highly volatile reaction deep within Clara's battered soul. The crippling, suffocating social anxiety that had kept her paralyzed and subservient for years was being entirely burned away by a fiery, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated anger. She was no longer the frightened, stuttering orphan girl who constantly shrank away from the judging, cruel glares of high society's elite predators. As Clara sat shivering on the rusted, wet bench, the chaotic, raging storm around her seemed to perfectly match the fierce, terrifying resolve rapidly blooming in her hollow chest. She was absolutely not going to quietly disappear into the night and let Eleanor confidently control the final, tragic narrative of her completely ruined marriage. If the powerful, untouchable Sterling family wanted a spectacular, unforgettable public show, then she was going to gladly give them a devastating grand finale they would never, ever recover from. Clara slowly stood up from the wet metal bench, entirely ignoring the agonizing, sharp pain radiating from her bleeding feet, and turned her back on the wealthy district forever. She began to walk steadily into the unforgiving, stormy night, each purposeful, deliberate step, fueled by the burning, unshakable promise of a magnificent and absolute retribution. Chapter 6: The Architect of Ashes. The flickering neon sign of a rundown, 24-hour diner cut through the torrential downpour, offering the only beacon of warmth on the desolate street. Clara pushed through the heavy, smudge-covered glass door, the small brass bell above it chiming with a sharp, lonely sound that echoed in the empty restaurant. The exhausted waitress behind the counter looked up from her magazine, her tired eyes widening in pure shock at the sight of the soaked, barefoot woman. Clara stood shivering by the entrance, her ruined, ruby-encrusted red gown dripping dark, muddy water onto the faded and cracked linoleum floor. Without uttering a single word, she walked slowly over to a shadowy corner booth and slid into the torn vinyl seat. She didn't have a single dollar, credit card, or piece of identification to her name, having left everything behind in that gilded cage. Yet, the kind, observant waitress silently walked over and placed a steaming, heavy ceramic mug of black coffee on the table before quietly walking away. Clara wrapped her trembling, freezing hands tightly around the thick mug, letting the intense, burning heat slowly thaw the absolute numbness in her bones. The cheap, bitter taste of the diner coffee grounded her, violently severing the final lingering ties to the imported vintage champagnes of her past life. As her violent physical shivering finally began to subside, her mind aggressively shifted into a state of terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. The crippling fear that had tightly gripped her vocal cords for 3 agonizing years was entirely washed away by the sheer magnitude of her newfound rage. For 3 long years, Alina and Julian had treated her like a piece of invisible, insignificant decorative furniture in their lavish, sprawling mansion. They had arrogantly assumed that because she was quiet, shy, and suffered from a severe stutter, she was also completely deaf, blind, and stupid. That fatal, arrogant underestimation by the elite billionaires was about to become the absolute, catastrophic downfall of the mighty Sterling Empire. Clara had spent countless, agonizing hours sitting silently in the corner of Julian's luxurious home office, nervously knitting while he worked. Because he viewed her as a simpleton, he freely conducted aggressive, highly illegal business deals on speakerphone while she sat only a few feet away. She had quietly, obediently poured afternoon tea for Alina during private, closed-door meetings in the grand parlor. During those meetings, the ruthless matriarch openly discussed bribing high-ranking city officials and illegally manipulating zoning laws for their massive real estate developments. Clara knew the exact, real names of the corrupt politicians, the secret offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the specific dates of every fraudulent transaction. She possessed the precise dollar amounts, the hidden blackmail files, and the secret passwords to private servers that Julian arrogantly thought were entirely untraceable. Clara's perceived weakness and silence had actually granted her absolute, unrestricted access to the darkest, most closely guarded secrets of the billionaire family. They had meticulously and joyfully stripped away her dignity tonight, believing they had finally broken her spirit into a million irreparable pieces. But they had completely, foolishly forgotten that this invisible, stuttering girl still held the master keys to their heavily guarded, corrupt kingdom. Clara gently asked the sympathetic waitress for a cheap pen and a spare paper order pad, her voice surprisingly smooth and steady in the quiet diner. It was completely devoid of the terrified, broken stutter that had plagued her just hours ago on that massive mahogany stage. The very moment the cheap blue ink touched the rough, lined paper, Clara began to meticulously catalog every single piece of incriminating evidence stored in her flawless memory. She wrote furiously, page after page, detailing the massive tax evasions, the illegal land grabs, and the ruthless intimidation campaigns Alina had orchestrated against her business rivals. This wasn't just about throwing a glass of expensive wine in a cruel mother-in-law's face or causing a minor, fleeting scandal in a local tabloid magazine. Clara was carefully drafting a comprehensive, legally binding blueprint designed to completely, systematically dismantle a $10 billion corporation from the inside out. She knew perfectly well that she couldn't simply walk into a local police station with a handwritten notebook and a crazy story. The untouchable Sterlings basically owned half the police force, the judges, and the politicians in the sprawling city. The corrupt authorities would merely bury the evidence, politely inform Alina, and ensure Clara's swift, quiet, and permanent disappearance. She desperately needed a powerful, fearless ally who hated Alina Sterling just as much, if not far more, than she did. And Clara knew exactly who that perfect person was. Alexander Vance, the ruthless, independent investigative journalist who had dedicated his entire career to exposing elite corruption. Alina had successfully sued Vance for massive defamation 2 years ago, nearly destroying his entire career and forcing him into independent, underground digital journalism. Vance was incredibly hungry for vengeance, armed with a massive online platform, and completely immune to the intimidating, violent tactics of the wealthy elite. Clara knew with absolute certainty that if she handed Vance this explosive, undeniable proof, he would not hesitate to drop a nuclear bomb on the Sterling legacy. The billionaire family had severely miscalculated the explosive danger of pushing a desperate, highly intelligent woman completely past the point of no return. Outside the diner's foggy, rain-streaked windows, the violent thunderstorm finally began to slowly break, giving way to the faint, gray light of the early morning. Clara looked down at the thick stack of filled paper, her exhausted, dark eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire that could easily reduce the Sterling manor to ashes. She had entered that glamorous, terrifying ballroom as a frightened, stuttering victim, totally dependent on the conditional mercy of absolute monsters. But she was confidently walking out of this cheap, roadside diner as the ultimate, unstoppable architect of their inevitable, catastrophic destruction. The heavy velvet curtain of high society was about to be violently ripped down, and Clara was more than ready to show the entire world the hideous, rotten truth hiding behind it. Chapter 7. The Nuclear Launch Codes. The early morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick, gray clouds as Clara stood outside a dilapidated brick building on the outskirts of the city. This rough, industrial neighborhood was a world away from the pristine, manicured lawns and towering iron gates of the Sterling estate. She looked down at the crumpled, damp paper in her hand, double-checking the address she had memorized from a late-night television broadcast months ago. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Clara pushed open the heavy glass door and climbed 3 flights of dimly lit, creaking wooden stairs. At the end of a narrow hallway, a frosted glass door bore the faded stenciled name of Alexander Vance, Independent Investigative Journalism. Clara knocked firmly, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet, empty corridor. A gruff voice called out from inside, and Clara turned the brass knob, stepping into a chaotic office overflowing with towering stacks of files and empty coffee cups. Alexander Vance sat behind a massive, cluttered desk, his tired eyes squinting at the glaring light of his computer monitor. He looked up, expecting to see a disgruntled landlord or a local informant, but froze completely at the sight of the woman standing in his doorway. Despite her disheveled hair, pale face, and the ruined, mud-stained red designer dress, Vance instantly recognized the infamous daughter-in-law of the Sterling Empire. "Mrs. Sterling," Vance said slowly, his voice dripping with a heavy mixture of suspicion and undisguised disdain. "I assume you are incredibly lost, because your mother-in-law's lawyers usually communicate with me through threatening legal injunctions, not personal visits." Clara didn't flinch at his hostility, calmly walking over to the desk and taking a seat in the worn leather chair opposite him. "I am not here on behalf of Alina Sterling, Mr. Vance," Clara stated clearly, her voice entirely devoid of the stutter that had ruined her life the night before. "I am here to offer you the exact weapon you need to completely, permanently destroy her." Vance leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as a cynical, mocking smile slowly spread across his unshaven face. He had spent years trying to penetrate the fortress of the Sterling Corporation, only to be financially ruined and professionally discredited by Alina's ruthless legal team. And why would the crown princess of the Sterling legacy want to burn down her own billion-dollar castle? He asked, his eyes narrowing with intense scrutiny. Clara reached into her pocket and placed the thick, folded stack of diner order papers onto the center of his cluttered desk. "Because they locked me in the dungeon and threw away the key," she replied coldly, pushing the handwritten notes toward him. Vance hesitantly picked up the damp papers, his cynical expression quickly shifting to absolute, unadulterated shock as he read the first few lines. His eyes darted rapidly across the pages, absorbing the meticulously detailed accounts of offshore accounts, bribed zoning officials, and illegal land seizures. Clara watched him intently, knowing that she was handing over the nuclear launch codes to a man who had nothing left to lose. "These are very specific dates, incredibly precise dollar amounts, and actual account numbers in the Cayman Islands," Vance whispered, completely stunned by the sheer volume of illicit data. "Alina considered me to be a deaf, mute, and stupid piece of furniture, Mr. Vance," Clara explained, a dark, bitter smile touching her lips. "She freely discussed her criminal empire right in front of me, arrogantly believing that a stuttering girl from a poor neighborhood could never comprehend high finance. Vance looked up from the papers, finally seeing the terrifying, burning resolve in the eyes of the woman sitting across from him. This was no longer a frightened, abused socialite. This was a highly calculated, lethal weapon forged in the fires of ultimate humiliation. If even 10% of this information is verifiable, Julian and Alina Sterling will face decades in federal prison, Vance said, his voice trembling with adrenaline and the sweet promise of vengeance. It is all true, and I can give you the exact passwords to Julian's private, encrypted servers to verify every single transaction, Clara promised without a single ounce of hesitation. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intense, unbreakable ferocity. But we have to strike immediately, before Alina realizes that her obedient little victim has finally decided to bite back. Vance aggressively swept the old coffee cups off his desk, immediately firing up 3 different computer monitors and pulling a massive recording microphone toward him. For the next 8 hours, they worked in absolute, focused silence, verifying offshore routing numbers, cross-referencing political donations, and building an impenetrable, legally bulletproof exposé. Clara sat beside him, watching the undeniable digital proof of the Sterling family's rotting, corrupt core materialize on the glowing screens. The media empire that had mocked her stutter, the elite society that had laughed at her red dress, and the husband who had cowardly turned his back were all entirely built on a foundation of massive, undeniable fraud. As the sun began to set over the city, Vance hit the final keystroke, preparing to broadcast the explosive investigative report across every major digital platform in the country. He turned to Clara, his finger hovering over the glowing publish button, silently asking for her final, irreversible confirmation. Clara looked at the screen, envisioning Alina's perfectly manicured face twisting in absolute horror as her pristine legacy was violently ripped to shreds. "Burn it all down," Clara whispered softly, the final traces of her fear vanishing completely into the shadows of the cramped office. Chapter 8, The Empire of Dust. The moment Alexander Vance pressed the publish button, an invisible, catastrophic shockwave violently rippled through the digital landscape of the entire country. Within mere minutes, the meticulously detailed exposé began to aggressively trend across every major social media platform, financial blog, and global news network. The impenetrable, pristine facade of the mighty Sterling Corporation was instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces of public disgrace. Deep inside the luxurious walls of the Sterling Manor, Alina was hosting an exclusive, celebratory morning brunch for the elite wives of the board members. She was gracefully pouring vintage champagne, basking in the glorious aftermath of her perfectly executed psychological destruction of her unwanted daughter-in-law. But the elegant, rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses was abruptly interrupted by a frantic, deafening chorus of ringing cell phones echoing simultaneously across the grand parlor. One by one, the wealthy women looked down at their glowing screens, their perfectly manicured faces instantly draining of all color and composure. The horrifying, bold headlines exposed every single corrupt bribe, every offshore tax evasion scheme, and the illegal manipulation of city officials that had funded their extravagant lifestyles. Wall Street reacted with absolute, ruthless panic, causing the Sterling Corporation's stock to violently plummet by 60% in the first 30 minutes of trading. Alina's smug, triumphant smile violently collapsed as she watched her loyal, aristocratic friends physically back away from her in absolute, unadulterated disgust. The very same high society that had cruelly mocked Clara's red dress just hours ago was now mercilessly turning its venomous fangs toward the disgraced Sterling matriarch. Before Alina could even attempt to formulate a desperate, manipulative lie to save face, the deafening wail of federal police sirens violently shattered the quiet tranquility of the estate. A massive fleet of black government vehicles aggressively smashed through the ornate iron gates, mercilessly tearing up the immaculate, imported landscaping that Alina loved so dearly. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents swarmed the grand entrance, their heavy combat boots tracking dark, unforgiving mud over the expensive, antique Persian rugs. Julian was violently dragged out of his luxurious home office in a pair of cold steel handcuffs, his handsome face pale, and contorted in absolute, pathetic terror. He desperately screamed for his mother's highly paid corporate lawyers, completely oblivious to the fact that his legal team had already abandoned ship the moment the digital evidence went public. The undeniable proof of his blatant racketeering and corporate fraud carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years in a federal penitentiary. Elinor was forcefully escorted down her own grand staircase by two stern, unyielding federal officers, her impeccable black designer gown completely ruined by the chaotic, forceful arrest. As she was shoved aggressively into the back of a waiting, caged police cruiser, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the sheer, horrific realization dawning in her cold eyes. She finally understood that the quiet, stuttering, terrified girl she had so brutally humiliated was the undeniable, brilliant architect of her total and absolute destruction. The Category 5 social humiliation she had meticulously planned for Clara had successfully rebounded, completely obliterating her own billion-dollar legacy in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, sitting in the quiet, dusty office on the rougher side of the city, Clara watched the live news broadcast on Vance's glowing computer monitor. She saw the devastating, highly publicized downfall of her tormentors unfolding in real time, broadcasted to millions of eager viewers who thrived on the destruction of the corrupt elite. There was absolutely no grand, boastful celebration in Clara's heart, only an immense, breathless wave of profound peace and ultimate finality. The suffocating, invisible chains of severe social anxiety and aristocratic terror that had bound her for 3 miserable, lonely years were finally broken forever. Alexander Vance silently poured 2 small glasses of cheap, fiery bourbon, sliding one across the cluttered desk to the remarkable woman who had just altered the course of history. Clara gently took the heavy glass, raising it slightly in a silent, deeply respectful toast to the brilliant journalist who had helped her execute the perfect, flawless retribution. She did not stutter, she did not tremble, and she did not shed a single, pitiful tear for the ruined billionaire family rapidly burning to ashes on the television screen. Clara slowly stood up from the worn leather chair, the muddy, torn remnants of the vibrant red dress no longer feeling like a cruel symbol of humiliation, but a magnificent, battle-worn cape of survival. She walked confidently out of the dingy, smoke-filled office and stepped back onto the bustling, noisy streets of the rapidly waking city. The dark, violent storm from the previous night had completely cleared away, leaving behind a crisp, beautifully bright, and endless morning sky. She had absolutely nothing to her name, no money in her bank account, no home to return to, and no wealthy, cowardly husband to hide behind. But as she took her first deep, unrestricted breath of the fresh, clean air, Clara smiled a genuine, breathtakingly radiant smile for the very first time in years. She was finally entirely, unapologetically free, and her brilliant, unwritten future belonged to absolutely no one but herself.